Tate Holloway's eyes scanned the ridge ahead, the trail of dust from the bandits' retreat barely visible against the harsh mountain terrain. His heart beat in time with his horse's heavy gallops, a rhythmic pounding that felt too loud, too real, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting. The wind howled, pushing against him, biting at his skin like the teeth of some wild animal. The sky above was a deep, unforgiving blue stretched over the vast emptiness of the Montana wilderness. The trail to the north was a path he knew well, but now it seemed to mock him, stretching on, endlessly teasing him with the faint hope of catching those who had taken the girl's last possession. Tate's horse kicked up the dust as it thundered down the uneven trail, the rhythmic pound of hooves drowning out everything else. He gripped the reins tight, his hand sweating against the leather. He was used to riding alone to the solitude of the mountains, the weight of the silence that accompanied him. But now that silence was gone, replaced by the image of her small, tear-streaked face as she clutched that pearl necklace like it was the only thing left of the woman who had raised her. Her mother. They took her. Annie had said, her voice steady despite the chaos that had surrounded her. They took Mama's trunk. It had everything. Tate's jaw tightened and he pushed the memory of her face away. His mission now was simple track, down the thieves, return the stolen trunk, and leave. That was all. He would give the little girl her belongings and return to his quiet life in the mountains. He would stay to himself, as he always had. But the promise she'd made hung in the air, an impossible vow that had no place in the cold, empty world he lived in. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a long golden shadow across the land. He'd been riding for hours, every mile pulling him further away from the one thing that had ever mattered to him. Tate had never wanted to be a father, never thought he'd be the one to carry the burden of another's life. But when he found Annie standing alone in the road covered in dust, with no one else to protect her, he'd made a decision that now felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. "Not my responsibility," he muttered under his breath. The words didn't sit well in his chest, as if the mountains themselves were questioning him. His mind flickered back to the moment when he'd first seen her, the little girl with dark eyes that shone with something ancient, something far older than her years. She had been standing there, her small fists clenched at her sides, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but with an intensity that stopped him in his tracks. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't helpless. She was angry. And she was determined. Tate had seen that look before, back when he was a boy standing in the wreckage of his own family. The world had swallowed his childhood whole, leaving nothing but bitter lessons. The wilderness didn't care about grief. It didn't care about promises. And it certainly didn't care about a child who had been left behind in the aftermath of tragedy. But Annie, she seemed different. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him, like she knew he would help her without asking why. Maybe it was the desperate hope in her eyes when she had asked if he was going after them. He had made a promise to her then, a promise to retrieve the trunk, no questions asked. But this was no ordinary promise. It wasn't the kind of vow that could be ignored or brushed aside. The memory of her words haunted him, the echo of her childish certainty filling the silence around him. "I'll marry you when I grow up." Tate squeezed his eyes shut, trying to shake the words free from his mind. It was ridiculous, the kind of thing a child might say, in the heat of a moment, without understanding the weight of her words. He wasn't some hero, some man who could offer a little girl a future. He was a mountain man, a drifter, who had nothing to give but the survival instincts he had honed over a lifetime of solitude. "I'm not her father." He muttered the words, tasting bitter on his tongue. But still, he couldn't forget the way she had said it, the way she had believed it. "I'll marry you when I grow up." Tate's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves in the distance. His body went rigid, every muscle tensed in an instant, his hand dropping to the rifle across his back. He slowed his horse, narrowing his eyes as he peered ahead. The ridge was barren, the landscape stretching on for miles, but the sound was unmistakable. Riders. 3, maybe 4 of them moving fast along the trail. Bandits. The ones who had taken everything from Annie. Tate's heart pounded in his chest, louder now than before. He tightened his grip on the reins, his body moving with a fluid precision that came from years of living on the edge. His horse picked up speed, its hooves eating the ground beneath it, its breath coming in sharp, fast bursts. He had to catch them before they vanished into the mountain's endless expanse. But the closer he got, the more he felt something strange stirring in him. It wasn't just the anger at what had been taken from Annie. It wasn't just the need to return the stolen heirlooms. It was her promise. Tate had never been one to entertain the idea of a future. But now, as the sound of the riders grew closer, something in him shifted. Maybe it was the way Annie had trusted him, had believed in him when he barely believed in himself. Maybe it was the knowledge that he could never turn back, that the course he had set for himself had already been determined by the promise of a little girl. Tate gritted his teeth and pushed harder. The bandits wouldn't escape him, not this time. He couldn't let them. He wouldn't. The terrain grew steeper, the path narrower, but Tate followed the sound, the fear in his chest gnawing at him. He wasn't just chasing down thieves anymore. He was chasing down something bigger, a future that he couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. A future that, for the first time in his life, included someone else. The wind howled louder as Tate urged his horse on the mountain's jagged peaks, looming over him like silent ancient witnesses. He was no longer a man who lived for survival alone. He was a man who had something to protect, something worth fighting for. And somehow he knew that the next step he took would be the most important one of his life. Tate Holloway didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time he was ready to find out. "I don't need anyone, but now I can't seem to leave you behind," Tate muttered to himself, as the girl Annie wrapped her small hands around his arm, never letting go. The wind was relentless, howling through the pines and sweeping the mountain passes in a bitter dance. The sharp scent of pine and earth hung in the air, mixing with the cold bite of the coming winter. It had been days since they had left the scene of the stagecoach robbery, but the landscape felt endless, and the quiet weight of the promise settled over him like the ever-present blanket of snow that would soon cover the peaks. Tate Holloway had never been a man who sought companionship. The mountains had been his refuge, his home, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, his fears, and the distant memories of a family he had lost long ago. He didn't need anyone to complicate that solitude, to force him into a world of ties and expectations. But Annie had changed something in him. He glanced down at the girl, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and worry, the streaks of dust from the road still marking her face. The determination in her gaze had softened somewhat, but there was still that quiet strength he hadn't seen in a child her age. She was strong, stronger than he had expected when they first met, standing in the middle of the wreckage of her life. She had been the one to ask him if he was going after the bandits, the one who had insisted on coming with him. And now, as they rode side by side through the mountains, she never let go of him. Her grip on his arm was small but fierce. "Are you sure you can't ride on your own?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The pack was too heavy for her small frame, and the trail was too rough for anyone unprepared. Annie shook her head, her dark braids bouncing against her shoulders. "I won't slow you down," she said, with a fire that took him off guard. "I can keep up," Tate grunted in response, his thoughts drifting again to the world he had left behind, the world of hunting, trapping, and surviving on his own terms. He didn't owe anyone anything. Yet as they rode through the rough terrain, each day feeling longer than the last, he couldn't deny the gnawing feeling that something had changed. Annie had a way of drawing him in even when he fought against it. She had become an anchor in the storm of his life, the one thing that kept him from being swept away by the bitterness of his past. He had known grief, had known loss better than most. He'd lost everything once, and the pain of it had nearly driven him mad. But now, as he watched Annie cling to him, her small body pressed against his back for warmth, he realized how much he had come to care for her in such a short time. It was a complicated thing, this bond. A child's promise. He didn't know how to make sense of it. They continued on the trail, narrowing as the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the jagged peaks. The pace slowed as the light began to fade, the chill of the evening creeping in. Tate pulled the reins on his horse, signaling for a stop. They needed to find shelter before nightfall, and his gut told him they weren't far from the bandits' camp. The last thing he needed was to be caught unaware miles from any help. "Stay close," he said, his voice rough from the cold air. "We don't know what's ahead. Those men could be lying in wait for anyone foolish enough to follow their trail." Annie nodded, her small face set with determination, her hands gripping the reins tightly. Tate's heart gave a twitch, and for a moment, he almost wished things could be different for her, for him. But he knew better than to wish for things he couldn't change. The camp they set up was simple. A fire crackled between them, the warm glow pushing back the cold, and Tate made sure the horses were tethered safely nearby. He handed Annie a small piece of dried meat, watching as she ate with the quiet efficiency of someone used to hardship. She was strong, he couldn't deny that. But she was still a child. Her promise to him, "I'll marry you when I grow up," hung heavy between them, an unspoken truth he couldn't escape. When they finished eating, Tate sat back against a rock, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. The fire crackled, the sounds of the wilderness settling in around them. Annie moved closer to the warmth of the flames, her small form a silhouette against the dying light. "You know," she began, her voice breaking the silence, "I remember when Mama used to sit by the fire and tell me stories. About how she met Papa, about the way they lived in the mountains before I was born." Tate's chest tightened at the mention of her mother. He had seen enough orphan children to know the pain of loss never really went away. It just became a part of who you were. "Do you miss her?" Tate asked, his voice softer than he intended. Annie looked into the fire, her dark eyes distant. Every day, she said, her voice small but steady. "But I don't want to forget her. Not ever." Tate nodded, understanding the ache she must feel. It was a feeling he had buried long ago, a wound he had learned to carry without complaint. But with Annie, it was different. The pain of her loss was still raw, still real. He could see it in the way she held on to the trunk, the way she spoke of her mother, as if she were still alive, still with her. "I promised her I'd take care of it." Annie continued, her voice quieter now. "The trunk, all of her things. I won't let them take it away." Tate's throat tightened as he watched her, his mind racing. He hadn't understood before, but now he did. The trunk wasn't just a box of valuables. It was all she had left of her mother. It was the last connection to the woman who had raised her, and Annie wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. He leaned forward, looking into the fire. "We'll get it back, Annie," he said, his voice low but firm. "I swear it." She looked at him, her eyes full of the same fierce determination he had seen when they first met. There was something about her, something beyond her age that made him believe her promise. But what did it mean? And what did it mean for him? He didn't know how to keep a promise like that, not when he'd never really trusted anyone to begin with. The night stretched on the fire, crackling as the stars above shimmered cold and distant. Tate sat in silence, his mind a tangled mess of thoughts and emotions he couldn't untangle. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking of the future of what he might offer someone other than himself. But for now, he had Annie, and that was enough. The wind shifted, sending a chill through the air as Tate stood stretching his stiff muscles. The campfire flickered, casting long shadows against the rocks. He looked down at Annie, her face peaceful as she slept, trusting him with everything she had left. "Stay close," he whispered again, almost to himself. The mountains loomed above them, their dark silhouettes a reminder that the world they were in wasn't one to be tamed easily. The path ahead would be long, and the challenges would only grow. But for the first time, Tate felt a stirring in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling, one he wasn't ready to name. As he settled down for the night, his thoughts turned to the bandits, to the promise, and to the girl who had changed everything. They won't escape this time. We're getting that trunk back. Tate vowed, his voice low hard as he scanned the mountain ridge ahead. The air was thin, biting with the early autumn chill, and the landscape stretched out before him in a patchwork of rugged rock and scrub. Tate squinted into the distance, his gaze narrowing as he saw the faintest trail of dust curling up from the valley below. The bandits had camped near the base of a narrow pass, where the terrain offered an ideal vantage point for an ambush. Tate's mind raced as he calculated the approach. The bandits might have underestimated the cold, but Tate had learned long ago how to track men like them, men who thought they could survive in the mountains without the respect they deserved. These men had left Annie's family with nothing but grief, and Tate wasn't about to let them slip away again. Annie rode beside him, her small form wrapped tightly in a thick cloak to ward off the cold. She had been quieter since they'd left the last settlement, her eyes distant as she glanced toward the distant ridge, a mixture of fear and determination in her young face. "Do you think they'll fight us?" she asked, her voice soft, but tinged with a raw edge of worry. Tate glanced down at her, feeling the weight of her gaze. He didn't have the answer she was hoping for. In his world, there were no guarantees, only outcomes shaped by the choices made in moments like this. He gave her a grim smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "They won't get the chance. I'll make sure of it." Annie nodded, but her grip on the reins tightened, her knuckles going pale from the pressure. She had grown into a strong, resilient child over the course of their journey, but Tate could still see the uncertainty flicker beneath her quiet strength. He wasn't sure how much of the world she truly understood, but he could see she was ready for whatever lay ahead. She had to be. The morning passed slowly, the sky overcast, dark clouds gathering above the peaks as they approached the bandits' camp. Tate kept his eyes sharp, every sense alert to the smallest movement. His mind was focused, the years of survival instincts kicking in as he prepared for what was to come. He had been alone for so long that the thought of keeping someone else safe felt foreign, yet he found himself needing to protect Annie more than he'd ever anticipated. She wasn't just a child to him anymore. She was part of something bigger, part of a bond he never expected to form. "You'll be okay," he said, more to himself than to her, but Annie heard him. She turned her head, locking eyes with him for a brief moment. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, though there was a hint of vulnerability behind the words. Tate swallowed the lump in his throat. He had no idea how he was going to face the bandits, much less the feelings that had surfaced inside him. But he couldn't afford to dwell on them now. Not when Annie was looking to him for strength. The bandits' camp came into view just as the sky began to darken, casting long shadows over the mountain pass. Tate's heart skipped a beat as he saw the flicker of movement by a cluster of rocks ahead. He motioned for the group to halt, his voice low. "Stay back. I'll scout ahead." Sam Gray, ever the loyal companion, nodded, signaling for Evie to keep watch over the horses. Sam, an old hand at this life, didn't need to ask questions. He simply followed Tate's lead, his rifle in hand, ready for whatever was about to unfold. Evie, too, was prepared. She had learned to be tough in the wild, the quiet strength in her eyes showing that she wasn't to be underestimated. Tate dismounted silently, his boots hitting the ground without a sound. He motioned for Annie to stay close to Sam and Evie as he moved forward. Every step was deliberate, every motion calculated. The cold air stung his skin, but it also cleared his mind, sharpening his focus. The bandits were camped in a small clearing, a fire burning low between them, casting eerie shadows against the rocks. There were 3 men, all of them rough, wearing the dust of the trail like a badge of honor. They didn't notice Tate's approach at first. He crouched behind a large boulder, watching their every move, trying to anticipate what they would do next. The sight of the trunk resting against a nearby tree nearly made his heart stop. It was hers. Annie's mother's trunk, the one the bandits had stolen. It sat there in the open, unprotected, like a taunting reminder of everything they had taken. Tate's mind shifted into a higher gear, calculating how he would approach. He needed to act fast before they noticed him. He'd never been a man to rush into a fight without thinking it through, but he wasn't about to let these men walk away unchallenged. He drew his knife, the steel blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. He would get the trunk back. He would make sure of that. He'd made a promise to Annie, and Tate Holloway never broke his promises. With a final glance at the camp, he moved quickly, slipping through the rocks and shadows like a wraith. His heart pounded in his chest, but his movements were smooth, practiced, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He had. But this time was different. This time the stakes were personal. The first bandit didn't see him coming. Tate's knife flashed through the air, cutting across the man's throat in one swift motion. The bandit crumpled to the ground, a soft thud lost in the noise of the wind. Tate didn't pause. He was already moving on, his eyes trained on the remaining 2 men. The second man turned just as Tate leapt from the shadows, his fist striking the bandit's temple with a force that sent him sprawling to the ground. Tate's knee connected with the man's chest before he could recover, and the bandit gasped for air as Tate's grip tightened around his neck. "Where's the girl's trunk?" Tate growled, his voice low and dangerous. The bandit's eyes flickered with panic, but he didn't answer. Tate's grip tightened, his patience wearing thin. "It's over," Tate said. "Tell me where it is." The man stammered, his eyes wild with fear. "Near the fire by the rocks." "Please, don't kill me." Tate released him, and the bandit scrambled backward, his hands raised in surrender. Tate didn't waste any time. He turned toward the trunk, his pulse racing. The bandits were no longer a concern. It was time to get Annie's things back. He was about to grab the trunk when a gunshot rang out from behind him, sharp and echoing through the pass. Tate spun around, his body tense, as the third bandit emerged from the shadows, a rifle aimed straight at him. "You're not taking anything," the bandit sneered. "This is where your journey ends, mountain man." Tate's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly assessed the situation. One wrong move and this could turn ugly. But he wasn't ready to die today, not when there was still a promise to keep. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet, and rolled into a crouch, his hand already on his revolver. The bandit was quick, but Tate was quicker. A shot rang out, and the bandit collapsed, his rifle falling from his hands. Tate stood up, breathing heavily. but the adrenaline was already wearing off. His gaze shifted to the trunk. He had what he came for. The trunk was Annie's. It belonged to her mother. And no one was going to take it from her again. The wind howled through the rocks, but for the first time in days, Tate allowed himself to relax. He had what they came for, but the fight wasn't over. The path ahead was still long and fraught with danger, and the stakes had never been higher. But as he moved toward the campfire to retrieve the trunk, his mind focused only on one thing, the promise. And now it was time to fulfill it. We're not just chasing after goods anymore, Tate. We're chasing after the last pieces of who she was. Sam said, his tone unexpectedly soft, understanding the weight of Annie's loss. Tate looked at Sam, his rugged face shadowed by the late afternoon sun. He had been so focused on the mission, on getting the trunk back, and getting Annie out of danger, that he had almost forgotten the deeper meaning of what they were doing. Sam's words hit him like a cold gust of wind. They were no longer just after stolen goods, they were after the remnants of a life lost, the last pieces of Annie's mother. And that was a weight that went beyond simple revenge. Annie sat by the fire, her fingers nervously twisting a piece of thread she'd found in the camp. Her eyes were cast downward, the flames from the fire flickering against her face, casting long shadows. She hadn't spoken much since they'd secured the trunk and taken care of the bandits. It was clear that she was still processing the violence, still coming to terms with what had happened. Tate stood silently, his hand resting on the rifle that was slung across his back. The camp was set up for the night, but the weight of what had happened today still hung in the air. Sam had been right. It wasn't just about the trunk anymore. It was about everything that had been taken from Annie, her family, her past, and now in some ways her innocence. Tate had seen a lot in his life, more than any man should have to. The violence of the frontier, the isolation, the loss, it was all part of the world he had come to know. But seeing Annie, a little girl who had already lost so much, it felt different this time. He couldn't explain it, but it was like a knot had formed in his chest, and it was only getting tighter the longer he spent with her. Annie, he said softly, walking over to where she sat. She didn't look up at first, her focus still on the small piece of thread between her fingers. Tate knelt beside her, his eyes softening as he looked at her face. "Are you all right?" She hesitated before meeting his gaze, her eyes still heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. "I'm fine," she said quietly, though her voice wavered just enough for Tate to hear it. He didn't press her for more, knowing that when she was ready, she would speak. Instead, he sat beside her, his posture relaxed, but alert. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. Sam and Evie were tending to their own tasks nearby. Sam was sharpening his knife, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, while Evie hummed softly to herself, her focus on gathering more firewood for the night. Both of them had been through enough hardships to understand the gravity of what was happening. They didn't need to say much to communicate their thoughts. They had Annie's back, and they were ready to move forward no matter what the next day brought. "Why do you think they took it?" Annie's voice broke the silence, her question hanging in the air between them. Tate glanced at her, surprised that she had spoken at all. "They were thieves," Tate replied, his voice steady. "They wanted what was inside the trunk. It wasn't just about taking what was valuable. It was about taking something that belonged to you. Something that tied you to your past." Annie nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "Do you think they knew what it meant to me?" she asked quietly. Tate hesitated. "I don't think they cared. It was a hard truth, but it was the truth. The bandits hadn't stolen the trunk because they understood its value. They hadn't taken it out of malice or revenge. They had taken it because it was there, because they could. And that was the kind of world they lived in, a world where survival and greed ruled. Annie went silent again, her eyes far away as she stared into the fire. Tate watched her, a lump forming in his throat. He wasn't sure if she understood the full weight of what had happened, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the reality of it would catch up with her. After a while, Annie stood up, her small frame silhouetted against the firelight. "I'm going to bed," she said quietly, her voice carrying a finality that Tate didn't question. She was still a child, still carrying more than her share of the weight of the world. But there was something in the way she moved now, something that wasn't quite like the girl he had first met. "All right," Tate said, his voice soft. "We'll leave at first light. Get some rest." Annie nodded, her face cast in shadows as she walked toward the blanket that had been laid out for her near the fire. Tate watched her go, his heart heavy with the burden of their journey. He wasn't sure how much longer he could protect her from the world, or from the weight of her promise. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Tate found himself unable to sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of the future, of what they were facing as they moved forward. The bandits were dealt with, but there were always more dangers ahead. The mountains were unforgiving, and Annie was still so young. He couldn't shield her from everything, no matter how hard he tried. But the promise she had made, it lingered like a weight he couldn't escape. He didn't know how to deal with it. He didn't know how to respond to her when she said with complete certainty that she would marry him one day. It was a child's promise, a moment of naivety in the face of tragedy. But in the depths of his heart, he couldn't help but wonder if she was more serious than he realized. He rose to his feet, walking over to the fire to add another log. The flames flickered as the logs cracked and popped, sending embers swirling into the night. The mountains around them were silent now, the wind having died down to a low, mournful hum. It was peaceful in the way only the wilderness could be. But the peace didn't last long. The stillness was broken by the sound of movement in the distance, something large, something fast. Tate's senses sharpened, his hand instinctively, going to the rifle slung over his shoulder. Sam and Evie were already awake, their eyes alert as they scanned the darkened landscape. The sound grew louder, the unmistakable rhythm of hooves pounding the earth. Tate's heart skipped a beat. "We've got company." Sam muttered, his voice low and tense. Tate nodded, his hand tightening around his rifle. "Get Annie inside. We don't know who this is yet." Evie hurried toward Annie's blanket, her voice low but urgent. "Annie, wake up. Get inside the shelter now." Annie, startled, sat up immediately, her eyes wide. Tate could see the fear flash in her gaze as she looked at him. But there was no time for comforting words now. The danger was real, and it was closing in. Tate moved swiftly, positioning himself behind a large boulder near the edge of their camp. The others followed, taking cover as they waited for the riders to come into view. The night had just become a lot more dangerous, and Tate wasn't about to let anyone get hurt, not now. Not after everything they'd been through. The road ahead was uncertain, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. "I never wanted this to be real. But it is, Annie." "It's real," Tate admitted, his voice breaking, as he looked down at the girl who now held his heart in ways he never expected. The night air was cold, sharper than it had been in days. The fire they'd built had died down to a few embers, casting weak shadows across the camp. Tate stood over the remnants of the fire, his rifle resting against his leg, his thoughts far from the quiet night. The danger they had faced earlier that evening, the riders that had appeared out of nowhere galloping toward them like ghosts in the dark, had left a sense of urgency in the air. But the true threat was something he couldn't run from. Not this time. Annie sat on the ground, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring into the darkened woods. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but there was something else in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. The promise. Her words from so many days ago still echoed in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape them. "I'll marry you when I grow up," she had said. Innocent yet unshakable. Tate couldn't get the thought out of his head, not with every passing day. When she'd said it, it had been a child's simple promise, a moment of misguided hope. But the reality of it, of her words, of her unwavering belief, hit him harder than any of the violence they had faced. Annie was not just a child anymore, not in the way he thought she was. She had taken on a weight far greater than her age, and now it seemed it was up to him to carry it alongside her. He turned back to the fire, his thoughts tangled. He hadn't been prepared for this. For Annie. He hadn't signed up to be a father figure or someone's protector. He was just a man who wanted to be left alone in the wild, who had learned to survive by depending only on himself. He didn't know how to be anything else. But Annie had made him someone else. The crunch of gravel underfoot broke his thoughts, and he looked up to see Sam approaching, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. Sam didn't speak right away, but his steady gaze told Tate everything he needed to know. He didn't have to say it aloud. The tension between them, the unspoken understanding, was enough. "She's a good kid," Sam said finally, his voice low but firm. "You know that, right?" Tate didn't answer right away. He simply nodded, looking back at Annie, who had shifted slightly, but her gaze was still locked on the distance. She was listening. She always was. "She's been through more than anyone should at her age," Sam continued, moving to sit down next to Tate. "But she's still here. And she trusts you." Tate rubbed a hand over his face, his rough fingers pulling at the stubble that had accumulated over the past few days. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked for the responsibility, the weight of a child's promise. But it was there, growing with each passing moment, like the fire that burned in the center of their camp. It was impossible to ignore. "I never wanted to be her father." Tate muttered the words, thick with frustration. "I never wanted to be anyone's father." Sam let out a slow breath. "You're not her father, but she needs you, and she's not going to let go of you, Tate. Not after everything you've done." Tate's jaw clenched, and for a moment he looked out at the dark horizon, his mind racing. Sam was right. Annie had already made her choice. She had chosen him, whether he was ready for it or not. But what did that mean? What was he supposed to do now? It wasn't just about keeping her safe anymore. It wasn't just about getting her the trunk. It was about something more, something he couldn't name yet. Tate stood up abruptly, the movement sharp and unsettling in the stillness of the night. He walked toward the edge of their camp, his boots crunching in the gravel, his thoughts consumed by the weight of the promise and the girl who had made it. The mountains, vast and unyielding, surrounded him, like silent sentinels offering no answers, no solace. "Is that what you think this is?" Tate's voice broke the silence. He wasn't speaking to Sam anymore. He was speaking to himself. "That she's just a promise I have to keep." Sam's voice was quiet, but it held a certain finality in it. "You've already made it, whether you like it or not." Tate ran a hand through his hair, trying to push the frustration away. "I don't know how to keep a promise like that, Sam." Sam stood and walked over, placing a hand on Tate's shoulder. "I know. But you don't have to do it alone. You've got us." Tate's eyes closed for a moment as the weight of Sam's words settled into him. He hadn't asked for this family, hadn't asked for the bond that had formed between them, but it was there. It was real. And it was all he had. He turned back toward the fire where Annie was now standing, her figure illuminated by the dying flames. She had heard every word Tate knew. She was more aware of everything than anyone gave her credit for. But what did she see in him? What did she want from him? You need to talk to her. Sam said, reading Tate's mind. She's not going to wait forever. Tate didn't move. His feet felt like they were glued to the earth beneath him. How could he explain something like this to a child? How could he tell her that the promise she had made wasn't something he could fulfill, that he wasn't the man she thought he was, that he couldn't be the one to offer her what she needed? But Sam was right. Annie was waiting. She needed something from him, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. He took a deep breath and walked toward her, each step feeling heavier than the last. She stood there looking at him with the same wide eyes that had first met him on the day they'd met. But now they were filled with something else, something more mature, something that spoke of the pain she carried and the hopes she had for herself. I know you're upset. He started, his voice softer than he meant it to be. And I know that promise you made to me, that's not something I can take lightly. But I need you to understand something, Annie. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. Annie's expression didn't change. She simply looked at him, her face steady, her small hands clasped in front of her. She didn't say anything at first, but when she spoke, her voice was firm. You'll figure it out. You always do, she said. Tate's chest tightened at her words. She was right. He always did. But this time the stakes were higher. This time there was more on the line than just survival. I'm trying, he whispered. Annie smiled, a small, quiet thing that reached her eyes. I know. As Tate looked at her, the realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was trying to protect something worth more than his own solitude. For the first time in his life, he had someone else to care for, someone else to live for. And that was a promise he was going to keep. You're no longer just a child who needs protection, Annie. You're someone I'm growing to care for in ways I never thought possible. Tate confessed, the weight of his own words sinking in. The evening air was crisp with a chill that nipped at the skin, but the warmth from the campfire provided a welcome contrast. Tate sat by the dying flames, his hands resting on his knees, the firelight dancing across his face. Annie sat a few feet away from him, her back to the fire, staring into the darkness. Her silhouette was framed by the flickering light, but it was her expression that kept drawing Tate's attention. She was quiet tonight, quieter than usual, and he could feel the tension in the air. Tate had never been good with words, especially when it came to feelings. But there was something about this moment, something about the way the world felt still, that made him want to speak the truth. They had been through so much together already, bandits, the wilderness, the constant threat of danger. But now, as they neared the edge of the mountains, something had shifted. Annie was no longer just the girl he had promised to protect. She was becoming someone he couldn't imagine leaving behind. Annie had always been strong, stronger than most adults he'd known, and yet there were moments when her vulnerability peeked through. Tonight it was there in the way she sat, her shoulders tense as she stared into the night. The promise, the weight of it, hung between them like a thread that neither of them knew how to cut. I'm not a child anymore, Annie said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't need to be protected. Tate's heart tightened at her words, but he didn't know how to respond. She was right, of course. She had grown in ways he couldn't explain, had endured things that no child should ever have to. But there was still that part of him, the part that had promised to keep her safe, that couldn't let go of the need to protect her. She had been through so much already, and in the silence of the night, it felt like the world had become too big for both of them. They were approaching a crossroads, and neither of them knew what it meant. You're not just someone I'm keeping safe, Tate finally said, his voice hoarse. "You're more than that. I never thought I'd care about anyone this much." Annie turned to look at him, then her dark eyes locking onto his, and for the first time, Tate saw something different in them, something that reflected his own confusion, his own uncertainty. She wasn't the little girl who had made a promise anymore. She was someone else now, someone who could understand the complexities of the world in ways that Tate hadn't expected. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, but there was something behind it, something deeper. "I know you care. But I'm not that little girl anymore, Tate." The words hit him harder than he expected. She was right. She wasn't that little girl anymore. The time for promises, for childish vows, had passed. They were both on the edge of something new, something neither of them had prepared for. But no matter how much Tate tried to distance himself from the truth, it was there, hanging in the air, like the smoke from the dying fire. He couldn't protect her from everything. He couldn't keep her in a world where she was always safe, always untouched by the harshness of life. "I'm not sure how to be the person you need." Tate admitted the words, coming out in a rush, as if they had been waiting to be said for a long time. "I've never been anyone's protector. I've never been anyone's father. I don't know how to make this work." Annie stood up, brushing the dirt from her pants, her eyes never leaving his. "You don't have to be a father to me, Tate. You've already done more than anyone else could. But I'm not going to be the one who needs protecting anymore. I can take care of myself." The fire crackled as Tate looked at her, his heart a mix of pride and sadness. He knew she was right. She was no longer the scared child who had clung to him when they first met. She was strong, stronger than anyone he knew, and she had proven it time and time again. But that didn't make it any easier. He couldn't let go of the part of him that had made that promise to keep her safe. "I don't know how to let you go," he said quietly, the words feeling like a confession. "I don't know how to stop caring." Annie looked down at the ground for a moment, her face softening. "You don't have to stop caring. You just have to trust me. I can handle what comes next. You've done your part. Now it's my turn." Tate's heart twisted in his chest. He had done his part. He had brought her this far. But letting her go felt impossible. He wasn't ready to face the reality of it. And yet, as much as it terrified him, he knew it was time. Time for Annie to step into the world on her own terms, to make her own choices, to live her own life. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting by the fire for so long. "You're right. I've done what I could, but it's not over yet. We still have a long way to go before we're free of all this." Annie nodded, her eyes serious, but there was a glint of something else in them now. Something that spoke of hope, of the future that was waiting for them. She was ready. And so was he. "We'll make it through, Tate," she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "We'll make it through together." Tate's chest tightened as he looked at her, a rush of emotion flooding him. She was right. They would make it through. No matter how difficult the journey ahead, no matter how much it scared him to think about what they might face, he knew one thing for sure. They would face it together. The fire flickered and then faded into embers, casting a dim light across their camp. Tate reached out and placed a hand on Annie's shoulder, his grip steady and firm. The weight of the promise, the weight of their journey hung heavy between them, but it wasn't the burden it once had been. They had come this far, and they would go farther. For the first time, Tate allowed himself to believe it, to believe in a future that included Annie, a future where they both stood side by side, no longer bound by the past, but free to walk into whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but together they would face it. Together they would find their way. The town will talk, Annie, but I'll protect you from what they say, no matter what. Tate swore, the gravity of their situation settling on his shoulders. The morning after their confrontation with the bandits, the air was thick with a silence that seemed to have settled over everything. The fire from the night before had burned down to a few glowing embers, casting a faint orange glow across the campsite. Tate, still weary from the events of the last few days, adjusted his rifle on his back and looked around at the group. They had made it through the wilderness, through the dangers of the mountain, but the hardest part was yet to come. They were approaching the town, and with it the judgment of its people. Annie sat on the edge of their camp, her back to the trees, her gaze distant. She hadn't said much since the night before, her eyes heavy with the weight of what they were about to face. She knew what it meant to return to civilization, to step back into a world where rules and judgments were a daily part of life. And Tate knew she was afraid, not just for herself, but for him, for the bond they had formed. What would the town think of them, of their journey? Tate had been prepared for the dangers of the wilderness, for the wild unpredictability of the land. But people, human beings, he wasn't sure how to face that. The quiet whispers, the sideways glances, the unspoken judgments, they could break a man faster than any bullet. "We need to move, Tate." Sam said, his voice steady as he packed his belongings. "If we stay here much longer, we'll be stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way to defend ourselves. The town's close, but we'll need to be careful." Tate nodded, pulling his jacket tighter around him, as if it could shield him from the world beyond the camp. He didn't want to go back to the town. The memory of his old life there, the whispers that had followed him even then, haunted him. The people in town knew him as the loner, the drifter. He had never been a man who fit in, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face the looks and questions that would inevitably come. But Annie needed answers. She needed closure. And that was why they had to go. He couldn't shield her from the world forever. No matter how much he wanted to keep her in the safety of their camp, away from judgment, away from the harsh truths of society, he knew the time had come. She had to face it, and he would be there with her every step of the way. As they packed up and made their way toward the town, the tension grew with every mile. The trees began to thin out, giving way to the openness of the valley. In the distance, Tate could see the outline of the town, its small buildings standing like sentinels against the backdrop of the mountains. The closer they got, the heavier the air seemed to become. The noise of the wilderness, the rustling of leaves, the sound of birds overhead faded into a silence that seemed to press in on them. It wasn't the same kind of silence they had known in the mountains. This was the kind of silence that came from fear. By the time they reached the town's edge, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the main street. Tate could feel the eyes of the few townspeople who were still out, their gaze following them as they made their way toward the center. He could hear the soft murmur of conversations, the rustle of skirts, the clicking of boots on the wooden sidewalks. They were watching, waiting. Annie walked just behind him, her steps sure, but Tate could feel the unease radiating from her. She was trying to be strong, trying to prove that she wasn't scared. But Tate knew better. She was scared. She had every right to be. She was about to step into a world that didn't understand her, didn't understand them, and she was alone in a way that made his heart ache. When they reached the heart of the town, Tate slowed his pace, scanning the faces of the townspeople. Most of them were keeping their distance, their eyes flicking toward him, then quickly looking away. The familiar feeling of isolation crept over him, and he felt a pang of bitterness. This town had never cared for him, never welcomed him. And now they would see him differently. he wasn't just the quiet mountain man anymore. He was the man who had returned with a child, who had made a promise. Annie stayed close to him, her eyes on the ground, not meeting anyone's gaze. She was trying to blend in, trying to be invisible, but Tate could see the tension in her shoulders. She was struggling with the same things he was. It was too late to hide. The town was going to know everything about them, whether they liked it or not. At the corner of the main street, they reached the saloon. The old wooden building loomed in front of them, its sign creaking in the wind. It was a place where stories were traded as much as drinks, and Tate knew that the moment they stepped inside, the town's gossip would begin in earnest. He hesitated for a moment, his hand on the doorframe, before he turned to Annie. "Stay close," he said quietly. "We'll get through this." Annie nodded, her face pale but resolute. Tate could see that she wasn't sure what to expect, but she was ready for it. Ready to face the people who had always been a part of this world, the world he had tried to escape, the world that was now a part of her future. As they walked into the saloon, the room fell silent. The low murmur of conversation stopped, and every pair of eyes in the room turned toward them. The familiar scent of whiskey, tobacco, and sweat filled the air. The bartender, a grizzled man with a face weathered by years of hard living, looked up from his work, his eyes narrowing when he saw who had entered. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gruff. Tate's hand instinctively went to the revolver at his hip, but he didn't draw it. He had no need to. They weren't here to fight. Not yet. But the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "We're looking for someone," Tate said, his voice calm but firm. "We've got some unfinished business." A man at the bar snorted, his voice thick with disdain. "You and your unfinished business can take it out of here. We don't need any trouble." Tate's eyes flashed with the sharp edge of anger, but he kept his voice even. "I'm not here to start trouble. But if you think for a moment that I'm leaving without a fight, you're wrong." The room remained silent, the tension hanging in the air like smoke. Annie stood beside Tate, her small frame rigid, her eyes darting from face to face, trying to gauge the reaction of the crowd. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was part of this world, part of the conflict that had been set in motion the moment they entered the town. Tate could feel the weight of the promise, Annie's promise, the promise he had made to her, pushing him forward. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a place for them both in a world that had never wanted them. And if he had to face down every last person in this town to do it, he would. As the bartender stepped forward, wiping his hands on a dirty rag, he gave a reluctant nod. "You're here now, and I don't expect you to leave quietly, but I'd suggest you keep your distance. This town's not kind to strangers." Tate stood his ground, his eyes unwavering. "We'll make our own way, but this is our town now too." The bartender didn't respond, but he stepped back as if giving Tate and Annie a chance to speak. The others in the room remained silent, watching, waiting to see how it would unfold. Tate turned back to Annie, giving her a small nod. She met his gaze, and for a moment the weight of it all seemed to lift. Together they would face this. Together they would make it through. And as the saloon door creaked closed behind them, Tate knew that the road ahead would be just as difficult as the one they had left behind. But they would face it side by side, no matter what the world had to say. "They don't know us, Tate, they can't. But you know what, I'm not going anywhere. I chose you, and nothing changes," that Annie declared, her voice firm despite the swirling gossip. The sun had set, casting a deep amber glow across the town as shadows stretched long across the dirt streets. The heat of the day had faded, but the weight of it lingered in the air, mixing with the tension that had settled over Tate and Annie like a second skin. They stood in the center of the town, their feet firmly planted on the uneven ground, surrounded by the whispers of the townsfolk. It felt like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Tate could feel the eyes of the people on them, the sharp, curious stares that followed their every movement. It wasn't just the way they looked at Annie, though, that was part of it. No, it was the way they looked at him, the man who had come back to a place he had long since abandoned, bringing with him a child who didn't belong. The weight of judgment was palpable, pressing down on him like a stone. Annie stood tall beside him, her back straight, her hands clasped together in front of her. She was trying to appear unaffected, trying to hold herself together in the face of the scrutiny they were both under. Tate admired that about her. Despite the fear and uncertainty that had taken root in her heart, she was standing firm, refusing to let the world knock her down. But he could see it in her eyes, the flicker of unease that betrayed her tough exterior. She was scared. They both were. They had reached the center of the town after leaving the saloon, the air around them thick with the lingering hostility of the townsfolk. As they passed through the narrow streets, Tate noticed the sharp glances, the hushed murmurs that followed them like a cloud of judgment that clung to their every step. Annie didn't flinch at the whispers. She kept her head high, her gaze straight ahead, but Tate could see how much it was weighing on her. "Don't let them get to you," Annie Tate muttered under his breath, his voice low, meant only for her ears. She glanced up at him, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "I'm not," she said, but her voice wavered just enough for Tate to hear it. I just don't understand why they're all staring." Tate's heart ached for her. He wanted to protect her from all of it, wanted to shield her from the ugliness of the world, but he knew that wasn't possible. Not anymore. They had crossed into the territory of the living, where words and actions carried weight, and the judgment of others could cut deeper than any knife. "They don't understand us, Annie," he said softly, his voice tinged with frustration. "They don't understand what we've been through. And they never will." She nodded, her eyes flickering with something, anger perhaps, or defiance. But it was there, that spark of resilience, the same spark that had led her to make that promise to him all those days ago. The tension between them and the town only grew as they walked through the main street. The locals were taking note, their gossip carrying on the wind like a cloud of smoke. There were murmurs of judgment, whispers of disbelief, and the occasional skeptical glance. Tate had always known that coming back to this town would be difficult. He hadn't expected the cold reception, but he had known it would come. It always did. He had never been one to fit in here, never been the man the town had wanted him to be. And now with Annie at his side, it was even worse. They reached the general store where the smell of salt and dried meat wafted out of the open door. Inside, the wooden shelves were lined with goods, some of them new, others old and weathered by time. Tate stepped in first, holding the door open for Annie, who followed him in with a quiet, deliberate step. She looked around at the unfamiliar surroundings, her eyes cautious but curious. Tate greeted the storekeeper, a middle-aged man, with a balding head and a thick mustache. His eyes flicked to Annie briefly before settling back on Tate, a look of suspicion settling in his gaze. "What can I do for you, Mr. Holloway?" the storekeeper asked, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. Tate cleared his throat, shifting his weight as he looked around the store. "Just need some provisions. Whatever you've got for travel." The storekeeper nodded and walked toward the back of the store to gather what was needed. Tate's gaze moved to the shelves, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him, of the town watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. He was used to being the outsider, but this was different. Now he had Annie to protect, and the weight of her trust, her promise, hung over him like a heavy cloak. Annie wandered further into the store, her hands running along the wooden shelves, as she examined the goods. She picked up a small wooden carving and turned it over in her hands, her brow furrowing as she studied it. Tate watched her for a moment, the look on her face softening as she became absorbed in the object. She was a child again in this moment, unburdened by the weight of everything else. She looked up at Tate holding the carving in her hands. "I remember Mama had one of these," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a memory. "It was on the shelf in the kitchen. She said it was from when they were traveling together." Tate's chest tightened. He could see the pain in her eyes, the longing for something she could never have again. He didn't know how to comfort her, how to ease the ache she felt inside. All he could do was nod the lump in his throat, making it hard to speak. "We'll get it back," he said softly, though the words felt hollow, as if they had no real meaning behind them anymore. The storekeeper returned with the provisions, placing a sack of dried meat, a few cans of beans, and a handful of other items on the counter. Tate paid him quickly, the transaction brief and to the point. As he turned to leave, he noticed a group of townsfolk gathered outside their eyes, following him as he passed. They were waiting for something to happen. Annie stayed close to him, her steps quick, her gaze fixed ahead. She didn't want to be noticed. She didn't want to deal with the judgment that followed them wherever they went. Tate couldn't blame her. But the truth was, they couldn't hide forever. They were here in this town, and they would have to face it. They couldn't keep running. As they stepped back out onto the street, the cool evening air hit them again, and Tate glanced up at the darkening sky. The town felt different now, like it had taken a breath and was holding it, waiting for them to make a move. He could feel the pressure mounting with every step. "We'll be fine," Tate said, though the words felt weak even as he said them. "We'll figure this out, Annie. You're not alone." She looked up at him, her eyes steady and unwavering. "I know," she said simply, "but I don't need you to fight for me anymore. I'm not a child." Tate's heart clenched, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. But he knew one thing. He wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. Not when the world was still so uncertain. Together they walked into the heart of the town, where the world was waiting to see what they would do next. And for the first time in his life, Tate wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead. But there was no turning back. "I didn't realize what it meant to be a family. But now I see it's more than blood. It's the people you choose to stay with even when the world tells you to run," Tate whispered, realizing that what he thought was a burden was in fact a gift. The evening had settled into a cold, quiet calm, but the weight of the day's events still hung in the air, like a storm ready to break. Tate sat on the steps of the small cabin they had rented for the night, the warmth from the fire inside flickering through the window, casting long shadows on the dirt road. Annie had gone to bed hours ago, but Tate couldn't bring himself to sleep. His thoughts kept drifting like smoke in the wind, unable to settle on anything for long. He hadn't meant to find a family. He hadn't set out on this path with the intention of being someone's protector, someone's anchor. But here he was in the midst of a world he didn't understand, trying to make sense of the relationship that had formed between him and the girl who had once made a promise that seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. Tate rubbed a hand across his face, feeling the stubble that had accumulated over the past week. The ruggedness of his own features matched the wilderness he had lived in for so long. But now with Annie in his life, he was starting to wonder if he had been running from more than just the world. Maybe he had been running from what it meant to care to belong. The street was empty, save for the faint glow of lanterns in the distance and the sound of a dog barking somewhere further down the road. It was the kind of quiet that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. Tate felt it too, the stillness that came with the uncertainty of their place in this town. There was no escaping the fact that they were different, that their bond was something the world didn't understand, couldn't understand. But in that moment, with the cold air biting at his skin and the warmth from the cabin creeping around the edges of the door, Tate couldn't help but think that despite the danger they had faced, despite the weight of the promise Annie had made, maybe they were exactly where they were supposed to be. He heard the door behind him creak open, and he turned to see Sam standing there, a quiet look in his eyes. Sam had always been the type to let people come to their own conclusions, but tonight there was something different about the way he stood. A weight to his posture that Tate hadn't noticed before. He'd seen the same look on men's faces after they'd been through something that changed them forever, something that made them confront parts of themselves they weren't ready to see. Sam walked over to the steps and sat down next to Tate, his boots scraping the ground as he settled in. There was silence between them for a long moment, the only sounds the occasional snap of wood inside the cabin and the rustle of wind in the trees. "How's she doing?" Sam asked, his voice low, his gaze never quite meeting Tate's. Tate glanced back toward the cabin. Annie was inside, resting now, her quiet breathing the only sound that reached him from within. He hadn't heard her cry, hadn't seen the signs of the deep ache she must be feeling, but he knew it was there. She carried it with her every day. "She's tougher than I thought," Tate said, his voice steady. "She's not afraid to face what's ahead, but I can see it in her. She's scared. She's scared of what this town's going to do to her, and she's scared of what I've become to her." Sam nodded, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "She's not the only one, Tate." Tate felt a lump form in his throat, his chest tightening. He hadn't meant to make this about himself, but Sam's words hit harder than he had expected. He hadn't realized how much of his own fear he had been carrying with him. How much of it had been rooted in the idea that despite everything, he would never be enough for Annie. He had never asked for this life, never wanted it. But he had it now, and there was no turning back. "I don't know if I can keep this up," Sam Tate said quietly, his voice heavy with doubt. "I'm not the man she thinks I am. I've never been that kind of man." Sam shifted beside him, his voice calm but firm. "You're a hell of a lot more than you give yourself credit for. And Annie doesn't need you to be some ideal. She just needs you to be there. She needs you to stay, that's all." Tate shook his head, the weight of Sam's words settling deeper in his chest. "It's not enough. I'm not enough." Enough for what Sam asked, his brow furrowing. "Enough to protect her, to keep her safe. You've already done that. You've already given her a chance to survive, to grow. What else do you need to prove?" Tate didn't have an answer. He didn't know what else he needed to prove or to whom. Maybe he wasn't trying to prove anything. Maybe he was just afraid of losing what he had found, afraid of being the man who wasn't there when she needed him most. But the truth was, he had never been the man who stayed. He had always been the one to walk away, to keep moving, to avoid the weight of anything or anyone that could tie him down. But now, standing in the shadow of the life he had built with Annie Tate, wasn't sure how to let go. How to step back from something that had become so important to him. "We're not finished here," Tate said quietly, the words heavy on his tongue. "Not by a long shot. There's still more to be done. We can't just walk away." Sam's expression softened, his eyes looking past Tate into the distance. "I didn't think you'd walk away," he said. "I think you're afraid of being stuck, of being trapped by something you can't control. But you're not. Annie's not asking you to be her father. She's asking you to be someone who can care. That's it." Tate let out a breath, his chest tight as he looked back at the cabin. He hadn't realized how much he had been afraid of not being enough until now, until Sam's words had brought it into focus. Maybe he wasn't the man he thought he should be, the one who could fix everything, but that didn't mean he couldn't try. For the first time in a long time, Tate wasn't sure of anything, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't run. Not from Annie. Not from what they had built together. As the wind howled across the land, the silence between Tate and Sam grew, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding, the kind of silence that came after the words had been said and the weight had been shared. The kind of silence that settled over them like the warmth from a fire that had been rekindled. Tate stood up slowly, the weight of his thoughts shifting. He wasn't sure what the future held. He wasn't sure what it meant to be the person Annie needed him to be. But he knew he wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. He turned to Sam and nodded, the gesture small but full of meaning. "Let's get some rest." Tate set his voice steady. "Tomorrow we keep going." Sam stood up with him, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Tomorrow we see what happens next." And for the first time in a long time, Tate felt like maybe, just maybe, he could face what came next, whatever it was. Together. "I didn't realize it before, but I see it now. I love you, Annie. And I'll always protect you." Tate whispered, realizing that what he thought was a burden was in fact a gift. The cold morning air cut through the camp like a knife biting at Tate's exposed skin as he stood by the fire, watching the last embers crackle and die. The fire's warmth was slowly fading, leaving only a faint glow against the dull gray sky. Annie was still asleep, curled up under her blanket, her small form tucked tightly against the chill of the early morning. Tate glanced over at her, watching the rise and fall of her chest as she slept, her face peaceful for the moment, untouched by the weight of their journey. The silence of the wilderness enveloped him, the only sounds the occasional gust of wind and the distant call of birds. Tate took a deep breath, his thoughts heavy as he looked out at the landscape. The mountains stretched out before him, their peaks disappearing into the fog that clung to the ridgelines. It was the kind of place that made a man feel small, insignificant, as if the world itself had been carved from stone and ice long before he had ever come along. And yet, in that moment, with the weight of everything they had been through pressing on his shoulders, Tate felt something he hadn't felt in years. It had been a long time since Tate had allowed himself to believe in anything, let alone in someone else. He had been running for so long, hiding from the world, from the pain that had followed him for years. He had never wanted to be tied down, never wanted to be responsible for anyone else. But here he was, standing in the cold morning light, watching over a child who had grown into someone who was no longer afraid to stand up for herself. Someone who had made a promise to him that he couldn't ignore even though he didn't know how to keep it. Tate exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the frigid air. The promise that Annie had made, the one that had been hanging over both of them since the day they first met, had changed everything. At first he had brushed it off, convinced that it was nothing more than a child's wish, a moment of fantasy. But now, as they had traveled together, he realized that it wasn't just a promise to him. It was a promise to herself. And it was a promise that he couldn't break even if he didn't understand it, even if he didn't know how to live up to it. "Hey," Sam's voice interrupted his thoughts, and Tate turned to see the man approaching with a slow, steady gait, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Sam had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't need to speak much. But when he did, it was always with purpose. "She's awake," Sam added, glancing over at Annie, who had stirred and was now rubbing her eyes, slowly coming to life in the early morning light. Tate nodded, giving Sam a quiet look of appreciation before he turned back to Annie, watching as she stretched and yawned, her small frame still stiff from the long ride the day before. She was tougher than she let on, more resilient than anyone had a right to be after everything she had been through. Annie looked up at Tate, then her eyes locking onto his with the same quiet determination he had seen in her from the moment they met. "Are we leaving soon?" she asked, her voice rough from sleep but strong. Tate took a deep breath and nodded. "As soon as we can pack up. We're headed toward the next town over. It'll take a few days, but we'll make it." Annie stood up, brushing the dirt from her clothes, and walked over to where Sam had set up their supplies. She had been quiet this morning, the weight of the journey settling heavily on her young shoulders, but Tate could see that she wasn't backing down. She wasn't afraid anymore. The girl who had made a promise to him years ago was no longer just the innocent child he had first met. She was someone who had faced the darkness, someone who had proven that she could survive. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, Tate couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He had never asked for this, never asked to be the one who took on the burden of a child's promise, but now he couldn't imagine walking away from it. He didn't know what the future held for them, didn't know if there was even a place in this world for people like them. But he did know one thing: they were in this together. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. "Are we ready to go?" Annie's voice broke through his thoughts, and Tate turned to see her standing beside him, her gear packed and ready. He nodded and gave her a small smile. "We're ready." The ride toward the next town was uneventful, the landscape slowly changing as they left the wilderness behind and entered a more populated area. The terrain flattened, the trees thinning out into open fields, and the distant outline of buildings came into view. The closer they got to the town, the more Tate felt the unease settle in his chest. He had never been comfortable in places like this. The noise, the crowds, the constant hum of activity. It was a world that always felt too loud, too full of people who didn't understand him. And now, with Annie at his side, it felt like they were walking into the lion's den. Annie, for her part, remained unusually calm as they approached the town. She didn't say much, but Tate could see the way her eyes flickered over the buildings, over the people who were walking along the street, their eyes shifting toward them as they passed. She was feeling the weight of the judgment just as he was, but she wasn't showing it. She wasn't backing down. She was ready for whatever came next. When they reached the town's edge, Tate stopped the horse and looked around, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of trouble. The town wasn't large, but it was busy, its people moving in and out of the various shops, going about their business without a care for the two strangers riding through. Annie looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "What now?" she asked, her voice steady. Tate paused, his mind working quickly. They couldn't just walk into town without a plan. He couldn't risk putting Annie in danger. He had to be careful, had to make sure they weren't being followed, that the bandits hadn't come looking for them. "We find a place to stay for the night," he said finally, his voice low. "We'll figure out our next move from there." As they made their way deeper into the town, Tate couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the eyes of the town were upon them. The weight of their journey, of everything they had faced, was pressing down on him in a way that felt suffocating. They were no longer just survivors. They were now part of something much bigger than themselves, and Tate wasn't sure he was ready for it. But as they continued down the street with the noise of the town swirling around them, Tate couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was where they were meant to be. Maybe this was the start of something new. And no matter what happened, he knew one thing for certain: Annie was right beside him, and they were in this together. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Grief has a way of surfacing when you think you've buried it. And when it rises, it demands to be faced, not silenced. The storm had passed overnight, but the world outside still wore its sorrow in gray hues. The morning fog clung low to the ground, like a secret unwilling to be told. Inside the cabin, the wood stove gave off a tired warmth, crackling now and then, echoing like old bones shifting in the earth. Emery sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the warped floorboards that had seen decades of boots blood and grief. Junie hadn't stirred. She slept curled on her side, wrapped in one of the quilts Hannah had sewn before the cancer came. Emery had tried not to think about her these past weeks, but with everything unfolding, her memory stalked his every breath. He reached over to the drawer in the nightstand, fingers pausing on the worn handle. Inside was a photograph, black and white edges curling, of Hannah holding their stillborn son, her face a mixture of pain and reverence. Emery had buried this memory, convinced that if he didn't speak of it, it wouldn't follow him. But it had. And now, in Junie's presence, in her gentleness and stillness, those ghosts had begun to stir. He slipped the photo into his palm and closed the drawer with care, as if afraid the past might come roaring out with the creak of the wood. Junie blinked awake slowly. Her eyes, fogged with sleep, drifted to him. "You okay?" Emery nodded once, but his jaw tightened. "You're holding something." He hesitated, then handed her the photo. Junie stared down at it. "She was beautiful," she whispered. "She was," Emery said, his voice gruff. "And that's Elijah." He didn't make it more than a few minutes. Hannah never recovered. Junie ran her finger over the image like she was tracing history with reverence. "You never told me." "It's not something I tell," he muttered, then cleared his throat. "I used to think if I said it out loud, it would become real again. Like waking a sleeping grief. You've already been carrying it." "Silent or not," she said. "That weight doesn't disappear just because it's hidden." Her words hit like a spring flood, quiet, but impossible to stop. They sat there for a while, the silence stitched with memory and mourning. Emery didn't move. He didn't know how. Finally, Junie said, "Maybe that's what this place has been waiting for you to let it breathe again, for the stories that built it to be spoken instead of buried." He looked at her, then really looked into the eyes of someone who had lost nearly everything, but still chose to reach for life with both hands. A woman who had faced hunger, fear, and rejection, but never closed off her heart. Junie stood slowly still, holding the photo. She walked over to the hearth, where a wooden shelf displayed keepsakes of simpler times, an old horseshoe, a folded bandana, a dusty music box that hadn't played in years. With careful fingers, she placed the photo next to them. Emery stood beside her, unsure what to say, what to feel. "That part of your story belongs here," she said softly. "So you don't carry it alone." He exhaled, the release shuddering through his ribs, like a man unlearning how to hold his pain. And in that moment, with the photo nestled beside the fire, and Junie beside him, the cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a place that could hold sorrow and still offer warmth. Later that morning, Emery saddled Jet and rode out to the far side of the pasture to check the fence line. The rhythm of riding usually cleared his thoughts, but today they clung to him like mist. He kept seeing Elijah's tiny face, remembering how Hannah had rocked him, despite knowing he wouldn't last the night. Remembering how the air had gone still after the last breath, how she never spoke of it again. When he returned, Junie was on the porch with Martha, the older widow who lived over the ridge. Martha had brought bread, dense, warm, honey-laced, and a jar of her blackberry preserves. "Thought you two might need something sweet," she smiled knowingly. Junie introduced Emery. Martha studied him a long beat too long, then nodded with approval. "Looks like you finally opened a window in that heart of yours, Emery Holt." He grunted, but his eyes softened as he accepted the bread. "Appreciate it." Once Martha had gone, Junie said, "She told me she lost her husband during lambing season. Said she kept hearing his voice every time the wind blew over the hills." Emery nodded. The dead have a way of staying close in places like this. Junie looked toward the fields where the snow had melted into patches of earth and promise. Then maybe we honor them by living fully, not silently. As the sun broke through the clouds in timid beams, Emery realized that she was right. That silence was no longer protection, it was exile. And that Junie, with her quiet strength and unflinching honesty, was the bridge between past and future, between grief and grace. Inside, the fire crackled again, but this time it felt like an invitation. He kissed me like a man who had been waiting 16 years to find out if I meant what I promised. The barn was quiet, just the soft creak of old wood and the distant hush of wind through the cottonwoods beyond the ridge. Ember stood in the middle of it, her chest rising and falling faster than her breath could keep pace. Caleb was inches away, close enough that she could see the golden flecks in his eyes, close enough that the wild scent of horsehide and tobacco from his coat pulled at something deep inside her. He had just said it raw and plain and filled with all the years they'd both carried. I never moved on Ember. His words pressed into her like sunlight through cracked glass. Her legs trembled beneath her skirt, not from fear, but from the collapse of the weight she'd held for so long. "You never wrote back," he said softly, his voice no longer hard, but hollowed. "After your last letter. After you said you were leaving your aunt's house and heading out east. I thought you changed your mind." Ember opened her mouth to respond, but for a moment nothing came. The pain of those years clogged her throat. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded, worn letter. Caleb took it, his fingers brushing hers, calloused and trembling. He unfolded the paper with the reverence of a man reading scripture. "I never got this," he whispered. "I swear to you, Ember, I never did. I know that now," she said, her voice cracking. "But for a long time, I thought maybe you'd moved on too. I tried to, but no matter where I went, you were always in every place I looked." Caleb stepped closer. The distance between them disappeared like dust on the wind. And now, her eyes searched his. She wasn't a child anymore, and he wasn't the broken boy with a wounded soul she'd found leaning against the old split-rail fence 16 years ago. They were grown, worn, weathered, but alive. "Now," she said, breathless, "I'm done running." It was all the invitation Caleb needed. He pulled her to him, one arm strong around her waist, the other cupping the side of her face with the gentlest care. And then he kissed her. Not tentatively, not sweetly, but like a man who had waited 16 years to find out if the girl who once promised him forever had meant it. Ember melted against him. The kiss broke everything open. Years of silence, hurt, doubt burned to ash in the heat between them. Her fingers curled into his shirt as her heart broke and healed all at once. When they parted, neither spoke for a long moment. "I used to dream about this," Caleb murmured, his forehead resting against hers. She laughed through her tears. "So did I." They walked hand in hand back to the house. The stars were beginning to scatter across the sky, and a chill had settled into the air, but Ember didn't feel cold anymore. Not with his hand in hers. Inside the cabin, they didn't need candles. The fire in the hearth was enough. Caleb poured them each a cup of coffee. His hands still trembled slightly, the weight of emotion not yet settled. "You told me you couldn't be a father," Ember said gently, her fingers warming against the ceramic mug. "You still feel that way?" Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I was wrong. I was scared, Ember. I've lived in this place so long thinking I was too broken to give anything real to anyone. But watching you with Emma, it made me realize I don't have to be perfect. I just have to show up and love her. Love you." Tears glistened in her eyes. "That's all we need." He looked up, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you think she'd ever want that?" "She already does," Ember said. "She asked me this morning if she could call you Daddy." Caleb's head dropped into his hands. He didn't cry, not in the way men did when they were weak, but he shook shoulders rising and falling like a man who had just been handed back something he'd never thought he could have. Ember sat beside him and wrapped her arms around him from behind. Come meet her tomorrow? No expectations. Just you and her and a clean slate. He nodded, unable to speak. The wind outside howled once and then faded. A calm fell over the cabin. Later, as Ember lay curled in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant coyote cries and the familiar creak of the ranch house settling, her heartbeat steady for the first time in years. The ghosts of the past no longer felt like threats. They felt like proof that they'd both survived. In the room next to hers, Emma slept soundly, unaware that tomorrow morning the man she had admired from afar through drawings and silences would be sitting across from her at the breakfast table. And in the living room, Caleb Garrett sat by the dying fire, clutching a folded letter to his chest, letting himself hope for the first time in a very long while. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was sacred. The educational lesson learned from this story is that some of life's most meaningful bonds are formed not by plan, but by showing up when someone needs us most. Love does not always arrive on time or in the shape we expect, yet patience, honesty, and quiet perseverance can carry it safely through years of hardship and misunderstanding. This story reminds us that it is never too late to speak the truth, heal old wounds, or choose companionship over loneliness. In later years, especially, allowing ourselves to trust again can turn long-held sorrow into a source of peace and belonging.